Jai Hind everyone. I am Shruti Jain, Assistant Professor, MCA Department, Ajay Kumar Garg Engineering College, Ghaziabad. The topic that I am going to discuss today is identity management in online social network. It is covered under the subject privacy and security in online social media. The subject code is KCA 031. So coming to first, what exactly is identity management? It generally describes the management of user identities and their rights to access the resources throughout their identity lifecycle according to users' right, the restrictions associated with the established identities. This identity management system, it provides the services and technologies for controlling user access to critical information. Among these services and technologies, the well-known include the Active Directory, identity providers, digital identities, password managers, etc., etc. So when it refers to the online image management, the online personal branding or the personal reputation, online image management, it is a set of methods for generating a distinguished web presence of a person onto the internet. That presence could be reflected in any kind of content that refers to a person. It could include a news, participation in blogs or forums, his personal website, the social media presence may be in the form of pictures, videos, news feeds, or the photos that he is sharing. So whatever the user is sharing on the online social media, that is the online image management of that particular person. But it is also referred to as identity disclosure or identity theft, because when we are talking about the identity of a user that is being revealed onto the online social network, so here the person is disclosing his identity to that much extent that the identity theft could occur. So in online social networks, aspects belonging to both the meanings constitute an integral part of the identity construction process on these sites. So starting with what basically the identity management means. So traditionally, if we talk about the identity management, it refers to the task of controlling information about managed entities on the computers. These managed entities include the users, hardwares and the network resources, or even the applications that the user is using on the online social network. This information includes the data that authenticate the identity of an entity, which describes the actions the entity is authorized to perform. It also includes the management of descriptive information about the entity and how and by whom that information can be accessed and modified. So here when we are talking about the identity, it basically talks about the sameness or in relation to anything that bears just to itself. Now coming to what digital identity is. So till now we were talking about the identity management where we were talking about the physical identity of a person. Now coming to digital identity, when we are talking about the computer science, the term digital identity is used to define as the digital representation of the information that is known about a specific individual or organization in a specific application domain. So it includes unique descriptive data or allowing a precise identification of the entity among others, as well as other generic information. So an entity may have multiple identities and each identity may consist of multiple characteristics that can be unique or non-unique identifiers. So an identity domain, it is a domain where each identity is unique. For users derived from psychological concepts summarized by the future of identity in the information society, a digital identity can be seen as constituted by a personal identity, a shared identity, or an abstract identity. Now, the next topic that we are going to talk about today is the identity management models from identity 1.0 to identity 2.0. So if we talk about identity 1.0, identity 1.0 is the traditional identity management system. The identity management system that we are following today is basically the identity 2.0. So over the years, from the directory centric approach where the authentication means simply that an identity is registered on the service provider's directory, every service we have shifted towards the user centric environment where the identity can be truly be applied to a variety of service providers. So when we are talking about identity 1.0, it includes an isolated, centralized and federated user identity models. So when we are talking about isolated solution, the service providers are both the credential providers, that is an identifier provider and identify providers for their users. So a user can get separate unique identifiers from each of the service or the identifier provider he or she is associated with, and they have their separate credentials associated with each of these identifiers. But when we are talking about the centralized model, we have a single identifier and the credentials are provided by that provider, and that can be used by all the service providers. Now, when we are talking about the federated systems, we have a set of software components and protocols which allow the service providers to identify users within a federated domain throughout their identity lifecycle. Now, we have some of the examples of Identity 2.0 management system, that are OpenID, OAuth. So, OpenID basically describes how the users can be authenticated in decentralized manner via the third-party service. The users may create their accounts with their preferred OpenIDs, identity providers, and then use those accounts as a basis for signing on to any website which accept that OpenID authentication. But when we are talking about OAuth, it is a service that is complementary to, but it is distinct from OpenID, which provides a method for clients to access server resources on behalf of the resource owner. That could be a different client or the end user. It also provides the process for end user to authorize the third party access to their server resources without sharing their credentials. That could be the username or the password pair. So, they use some single sign-on or logging into the system for the when the system is connected to the internet for one single time, instead of asking for the authentication every time. Now, if we talk about the identity as self-presentation, so when we are talking about Web 2.0, that is Identity 2.0 scenario, we can affirm that the individuals, they express and expose their identities relatively to their networks. So, while they are doing so, the individuals focus more on the strong ties by close, intimate, high trust, long-term relations, and weak ties requiring where less investment is there in terms of informational capital or time. So, they can exist along a single channel which diminishes the noise of overlapping the identities. So, if a new identity fails, it costs relatively very little to cut that tie link to that particular identity, because there are very weak ties, they are not the strong ties that are being created. So, the ease and the freedom of generating different identities or these strategies, those are connected to the concept of masking identity. Whenever individuals interact in a social sphere, they portray a mask of their identity. So, the kind of a mask one chooses, it reveals at least something about the subject that is behind the mask. One might call this as a metaphor of the mask. Now, what identity disclosure is? So, information disclosure, it enables an attacker to gain valuable information about a user. So, when we are talking about the online social network where identities deal with the personal data, disclosure of confidential information, the user's profile, they contain the personal information and many of the users' extra information that are recorded by social services without notifying the users. So, this represents a risk in terms of exposure of this data or the user information or the identity abuse, where the user can lose control of the extra information, knowing nothing about who can acquire that information. So, the disclosure can be connected to the explicit data release, that is also known as self-disclosure, or the private information leakage. So, coming to what self-disclosure is, concerning the first issue, that is voluntary confidential information disclosure, it is often related with the online social network, where the OSN often encourages the registered users to provide as much information as possible. Like if you look into the Facebook or the Instagram, the users are posting their feeds or their news feeds, their pictures, they are also sharing their geolocation. So, that is the OSN or the online social network, they are encouraging the users to do so. So, users are therefore, there are some of the users who are also willing to provide the self-disclosure to obtain some advantage. The concept of self-disclosure and self-presentation are in this sense strictly connected. So, users employ an online social network as a performance identity So strategically, when they are presenting themselves through constructed profiles, user challenges, challenge is to increase their diverse network of the social ties. The next one that we talked about was private information leakage, which is related to the details about an individual that is not explicitly stated, but rather they are inferred through other details released or the relationships to individuals who might express that in detail. So over the years, we had several inferences attacks, or the ways to prevent them have been studied in literature. Some works are based on link-based classification and link prediction, while others focus on the attribute disclosure. So these other works consider attack over anonymized networks and other several methods to anonymize social networks as a way to prevent the user's identification. So if we talk about in general layman term, to preserve node identity in the graph of relationships, synthetic identifiers are introduced to replace the names. These naive anonymizations, they represent the easiest solution in online social network to perform social network analysis in the absence of the names and the unique identifiers. Now, talking about what identity theft is. So, based on their characteristics, online social networks, they have one of the greatest potential for abuse. Over the years, it has been demonstrated that identity theft or the personal security issues are ever-present concerns that are associated with the information disclosed online. So, while we are dealing with the personal information that is collected by the social network services, they include the full names, the addresses, birthdays, years, that is all the personal information that a person has, birthdays, years, the special dates, or the contact information or the photos. So, there the risk of seeing one's own identity stolen or used for unwanted or illegal purposes, that is very high, because the person is sharing everything onto the social media. So, even a selected few pieces of personal information, there has possibly the potential to provide identity thieves with a means to acquire identity based information such as social security numbers, credit cards, driver's license, etc. So, in all these cases, the attacks on identity make the theft easier to gain profits from stolen identity information. The attacks on social networks, they are usually variant of traditional security threats. Those threats include the malwares, worms, spams, phishing. However, these attacks are carried out in different contexts by leveraging social networks as a new medium to reach the victims. So, if we take an example, in February 2008, we had the Consumer Central, the Federal Trade Commission, they complained the database and gave a statistic of identity theft events in 2007, during which the Consumer Central received about 800,000 consumer frauds and identity theft complaints by the consumers. So, this normally happens when you are sharing a lot of information to the online social network. So, there we have a very high chances that that data can be stolen. Now, coming to what are social engineering attacks. So, from an attacker's point of view, if we talk about the access to the detailed personal information in social networks, it is ideal for launching any targeted or a social engineering attack. So, a social engineering attack is one in which the intended victim is somehow tricked into doing the attacker's bidding. Now, most online social engineering attacks, they rely on some form of pretexting. The attacker establishes a contact with the target and sends some initial request to bootstrap the attack. Now, in this sense, this kind of attack can come in various forms. It could be in the form of emails that masquerade as a breaking news alert, or greeting cards, the announcement of bogus lottery winnings. But most well-known attacks that we have nowadays are spam attacks or spear phishing. So, coming to what spear phishing attack is. So, in general, first let's understand what phishing is, as we have already discussed in the previous lectures. So, phishing is a practice of using fraud emails to gain access to personal information for identity theft. But whereas single mass email are sent to a certain number of people in the phishing attack, spear phishing attack they are customized and sent to a single person at a time, so that looks more authenticated, that it is not a spam message or something. So the aspect making this attack particularly insidious is that the spear phishing exploits the personal information that is extracted by the social network services to let users to fall into the false sense of security when receiving any customized email. The authors crawled several social networking sites and they downloaded publicly available information on the users. So then they manually construct phishing emails that contain some personal information on the victims that they were able to retrieve from social networking sites. So the results show that victims are more likely to fall these phishing attempts if some information about their friends or about themselves is included in the phishing email, because then they consider it as an authenticated email. Now, spam attacks. So the collected personal information that is also invaluable for spam attacks on social networks that are in the form of unsolicited messages. So spammers would have access to two things. The first one is have access to email addresses that belong to real people, and that is one problem spammers faces. They often do not know that the email addresses that they are collecting, they are actually being used by the real people, or they are just the secondary addresses that are not regularly used. The other one is they have the information about the people who are using these email addresses, allowing them to efficiently personalize their marketing activities tailored according to the knowledge from their target profiles. So the ability to associate that personal information with an email address is important to be able to successfully bypass spam filters. So these filters usually generate a list of spammy tokens versus good tokens after training with a large set of previously received emails. So as a result, what happens is an email that contains the name of the user receiving the email or the name of the people that he or she is acquainted with, they tend to receive lower spam ratings than the emails that are less personal. So therefore, if the spammer can include some personal information in the spam that he or she is sending, he or she would be able to improve his or her chances of reaching the targeted users. The next one that we have are impersonation attacks. So sometimes what happens is adversaries can take advantage of the trust relationship among the friends to craft more convincing attacks by exploiting personal information that is gleaned from the victim's page. In fact, the prerequisite for being able to access personal information is to have a confirmed personal relationship with the person who is concerned. So, for example, if we took in the look into the Facebook, a user is allowed to have access to his or her personal information only when he or she is a confirmed business contact or in a relationship as a friend. So, it is possible to raise levels of trust by injecting an attack into existing chat conversation or by impersonating an existing friend of the target. Impersonation means you are showing yourself as a friend of that person. So, by impersonating a high profile person, the authors show how effective an impersonation attack can be. The forged profiles, they receive many friend requests even from one of the target's immediate family member. So, we have two types of things. The first one is identity clone attack, where an already existing profile in the social network is cloned and the friend requests are sent to the contacts of the victim. So, here it is possible to steal the contact of the user by forging his or her identity and creating a second identical profile in the same social network. So, having access to the contacts of a victim means that the sensitive personal information provided by these contacts become accessible to the attackers. Then we have cross-site profile cloning attack that is also described in this attack. It is possible to automatically identify the users who are registered in one social network but who are not registered in another. So, the identity of a victim is then cloned in a site where he or she is not registered and forged into a social networking site where he is not registered yet. For example, a person who is onto the Facebook but is not using Instagram. So, therefore, what happens that the profile from his Facebook is taken up and it is cloned and created a profile onto the Instagram. Then we have reverse social engineering attacks. In reverse social engineering attacks, the attackers do not initiate the contact with the victim. Rather, the victim is tricked into contacting the attacker himself or herself. So, in this way, the reverse social engineering attack can bypass the current behavioral and the filter detection techniques that aim to prevent widespread unsolicited contact. So they are classified under two categories. The first one is targeted, untargeted, and the other one is directed and mediated. So if we talk about the first one, the targeted, untargeted, the attackers focus or does not focus on a particular user. But in the second one, the baiting action of the attacker is visible or invisible to the target user. So there again, we have the three types of combination of three attacks: the recommendation based reverse social engineering attack, demographic based or reverse social engineering attack, and the visitor tracking based reverse social engineering attack. So in the first case, if the attacker can influence the recommendation system and make social network issue target recommendation, he or she may be able to trick the victims who are contacting him or her. But in the second case, the attacker simply creates a profile that would have high probability of appealing to certain users and then waits for victim to initiate the contact. Finally, the attack in the third case, it involves exploiting the user's curiosity by visiting their profile. The notification the page has been visited might raise interest, waiting the users to view the attacker's profile. So here, what we are basically trying to say is the user should limit their sharing of data onto the online social media platforms so that they can be saved from all these kind of attacks. That's all for today.